how far back do you want to go? Are we doing muskets? Are we doing the Second Amendment?
I want to go as far back as the simple, plain text of the United States Constitution. Scalia, when he was alive, and now Thomas and Alito especially, keep lecturing us about how important text is. Well, the text of the Second Amendment, as everybody knows, is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged. A well-regulated militia. From 1789 to 2008, and that's a long time, virtually everybody thought the Second Amendment was passed originally. We know why it was passed originally. It was basically to make sure states would have well-formed militias of all able-bodied men to fight off a tyrannical federal government. Had nothing to do with self-defense in the home, had nothing to do with hunting. So not surprisingly, in the 1930s, the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment only applies to militia-type weapons. And that's where we were. In the 1970s, the NRA was very big on gun safety and did great jobs, I think, teaching people about gun safety. And then Ryan can help me out here. At some moment in time, the NRA shifted from a gun safety type organization to a gun profits organization. Ryan, is that right?
Yeah, 77, sort of the radicals, 1977, the radicals took over the NRA convention. And as with many things, sort of conservative or reactionary, they played the long game, right? So the long game was apparently in 2021, 22, we end up here after the court cases that Eric is about ready to describe, where this sort of detente, I would say, between a gun-owning public that understood that it needed to be responsible and adhere to certain rules and regulations, and that the Constitution, its rights were the same as all other rights. They couldn't be outbalanced. Like, we lived in this sort of, not perfect, but a sort of detente in our society where gun owners understood that, to where we are today. And Eric can describe where we are today now.
So what might be interesting, we haven't talked about much, Pete, in the past, is that switch from the NRA, in addition to the Federalist Society beginning in 1982, and the original Federalist Society, the Ed Mises and those people, hated Roe so much that they're related, actually. If the liberals get Roe, then we get a strong Second Amendment. That was like a motto of a lot of people. And Supreme Court decisions like these across the board are affected by social movements. So we don't get Brown versus Board of Education, for example, in 1954, without a big kind of civil rights social movement led by Thurgood Marshall and some other people. Ruth Bader Ginsburg led a social movement for gender equality in the courts. Well, and so it works for both sides, left and right, don't get me wrong. But here, the movement began to try to convince people that the Second Amendment was not what it was, to convince people that the Second Amendment was a strong rights-granting provision to individuals, which it never was. Justice, and we've talked about this before, Pete, Chief Justice Warren Burger, a gun-toting Republican from Minnesota, said long before Heller, seeing this social movement arise, he said, the people who are trying to convince you that the Second Amendment protects a personal right to own guns are committing a fraud on the American public. Yeah. He used the word fraud. He didn't say it was imprecise or inaccurate or historically unfounded. He said it was a fraud. I want to emphasize that because this was intentional. It was intentionally misleading information about what the Second Amendment was originally meant to do and what it stands for. So eventually, in 2008, the court decides the Heller case. D.C. had banned all handguns. And by the way, D.C. banned all handguns in the early 70s. The law had been on the books for like 40 years or so. Wow. Yeah, it wasn't like yesterday. And for the first time in American history, the Supreme Court found that the Second Amendment owns the right to own guns. And what Justice Scalia did, and virtually every historian agrees with this, and leaving aside law professors, is he took the words of well-regulated militia and said, they don't mean anything. They don't count. They're just words for words. And it was a completely made-up construct of the text. Then they made up a construct of the history. But all they did in that case was say you can't completely ban handguns. That was the entire holding. And they didn't really give us a test and all that stuff. 2 years later, in the McDonald decision, they applied that to the states because D.C. is not a state. So we had to go through the motions of applying the holding of Heller to the states when Chicago banned all handguns, and they did that. And then we stopped, Pete. In 2010, we stopped, and states were inundated with lawsuits about gun laws. Most courts upheld those laws, where there was a limit on the amount of guns you can, all kinds of different ways to limit gun rights. And the Supreme Court denied cert, with Justice Thomas and Scalia consistently whining about it in dissents.